The clinking of champagne glasses at the Sapphire Lounge masked the subtle fracture in Daniel's marriage. Evelyn's PhD graduation party was supposed to be their shared triumph after 7 grueling years of his financial and emotional support. But as he approached her circle of new elite colleagues, the warmth in his chest turned to ice. He caught the tail end of her laugh, followed by the chilling words, "Oh, Daniel, he's just temporary. A stepping stone." The crystal glass in his hand suddenly felt heavier than a tombstone. If you love deep, emotional stories about love, betrayal, and the painful truth of human relationships, subscribe to our channel for more cinematic audio experiences. The ambient lighting of the Sapphire Lounge cast a golden hue over the elite crowd, reflecting off crystal champagne flutes and polished mahogany. Tonight was supposed to be a culmination of a decade's worth of sacrifices. Daniel Foster stood near the oak bar, adjusting the cuffs of his slightly worn suit, his gaze fixed lovingly on his wife across the room. Evelyn looked radiant. Her academic robes had been traded for a sleek, emerald green evening gown that seemed to belong to a different woman, a woman who no longer needed a tired architect to proofread her thesis at 3 in the morning. For 7 years, Daniel had poured every ounce of his energy, every delayed promotion, and every spare dollar into Evelyn's education. He had weathered the lonely nights and the constant anxiety of living on a single income in the heart of Boston's Back Bay. Watching her now, laughing effortlessly with the senior partners from Kingsley and Partners, he felt a profound, exhausting sense of accomplishment. They had made it. The struggle was finally over. He picked up 2 fresh glasses of champagne, navigating through the sea of academics and corporate heavyweights. He wanted to surprise her, to stand by her side as her husband and equal. But as he approached the dimly lit alcove where Evelyn stood with a tall, sharp-featured man named Julian, Daniel's footsteps slowed. The jazz band playing in the corner seemed to fade, isolating the sound of Evelyn's voice. It wasn't the warm, familiar tone she used with him at home. It was a calibrated, sophisticated purr. "It's a transition phase, Julian. You know that," Evelyn was saying, swirling the amber liquid in her glass with practiced elegance. Julian chuckled, a low, intimate sound. "And the husband? He seems quite dedicated." Daniel froze just behind a marble pillar, the cold stone biting through his jacket. Evelyn sighed, an elegant dismissal that made Daniel's blood run cold. "Daniel is sweet, but let's be realistic. We're in completely different worlds now. He was exactly what I needed to get through the program, but fundamentally, he's just temporary. A stepping stone." The clinking of glasses around him suddenly sounded like shattering glass. Daniel looked down at his own hands, holding the 2 flutes of champagne. The golden liquid trembled, mirroring the violent tremor in his chest. A stepping stone. 7 years of his life, his youth, his unwavering devotion, distilled into a casual, heartless punchline for the amusement of a stranger. He stepped back, the shadows of the alcove swallowing him. As he turned away, his eyes caught a fleeting detail, Julian's hand subtly brushing against the small of Evelyn's back, a gesture too familiar, too practiced. And Evelyn didn't pull away. The ride back to their apartment at the Meridian was a study in suffocating silence. Rain had begun to slick the Boston streets, the rhythmic, monotonous swish of the windshield wipers the only sound filling the cabin of their aging sedan. Daniel kept his hands locked at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, his knuckles bleached white from the pressure, his eyes fixed dead ahead on the blurred red taillights of the evening traffic. Beside him, Evelyn was a phantom illuminated by passing street lamps. She leaned against the passenger window, her emerald gown pooling elegantly around her legs. She was humming softly, a faint, contented melody that scraped violently against Daniel's raw nerves. Earlier that evening, he would have smiled at her happiness, believing it was a shared victory. Now, every note felt like a calculated mockery. A stepping stone. The phrase looped continuously in his mind, toxic and unrelenting. He didn't confront her. The shock was still too thick, wrapping tightly around his chest and paralyzing his vocal cords. Instead, his mind began to race backwards, frantically pulling at the loose threads he had willfully ignored for the past year. He noticed the subtle, lingering scent of bergamot and sharp cedar on her skin, a sophisticated, expensive men's cologne that certainly did not belong to him. He remembered the sudden shift in her wardrobe a few months ago, the quiet disposal of her comfortable study sweaters for tailored silk blouses and sharp blazers. She had bought them using the overtime bonus he had earned from a grueling hospital renovation project, claiming she needed to dress for the career she wanted. "Are you all right, Daniel?" Evelyn's voice broke the heavy quiet, startling him. She didn't turn her head, her gaze still casually tracing the rainy cityscape outside her window. "You were awfully quiet toward the end of the night. I barely saw you after the champagne toast." "Just tired," Daniel lied. His voice sounded hollow, scraping like dry leaves, even to his own ears. "It's been a long week at the firm." She murmured, a dismissive, indifferent sound. "Well, you should rest this weekend. I'll be busy anyway. Julian and the senior partners want to outline the new research initiative before Monday." Julian. The name dropped into the cramped space of the car like a lead weight. Daniel risked a brief, sideways glance. Evelyn was casually scrolling through her phone, the screen subtly tilted away from his line of sight, a habit she had developed recently, which she had smoothly disguised as a desire to reduce screen glare. As Daniel pulled into the harsh, fluorescent-lit underground parking garage of the Meridian, the tires squeaked against the damp concrete. Evelyn quickly locked her phone, slipping it into her designer clutch with a practiced, seamless motion. But in that fraction of a second before the screen went entirely black, Daniel's peripheral vision caught the bright glow of a notification banner on her lock screen. It wasn't an email about research initiatives or academic timelines. It was a single, crimson heart emoji from a contact saved only with the letter J. The digital clock on the kitchen counter glowed a harsh 3 in the morning. Evelyn was deeply asleep in the master bedroom, the faint, lingering scent of that foreign bergamot still subtly present in the air despite her evening shower. Daniel stood alone in the hallway, staring at the closed door of her study. For years, this small room had been a sanctuary he meticulously maintained. He had custom-built the heavy oak bookshelves to fit her growing library, upgraded the overhead lighting so her eyes would not strain during late-night reading, and worked overtime to pay the utility bills that kept it comfortably warm. He had always respected it as her sacred, private domain. Tonight, that boundary felt less like respect and more like a mocking barrier keeping him from the truth. He turned the brass knob, wincing at the slight click. The room was immaculate, completely devoid of the chaotic, desperate stacks of research papers that used to cover the floor. It now looked like the office of an established executive, not a struggling doctoral candidate. On the corner of her polished mahogany desk sat a neat stack of hardcover books. Daniel approached slowly, the hardwood floor biting into his bare feet. The top book immediately caught his attention. It was not a statistical manual or a peer-reviewed academic journal. It was a rare, vintage leather-bound edition of French Romantic poetry, a subject Evelyn had explicitly dismissed to Daniel years ago as overly sentimental and utterly useless for her career. He picked it up. The dark leather was soft and supple, visibly worn at the edges from frequent, careful handling. As he opened the heavy cover, a crisp, silver-tasseled bookmark slipped out, landing silently on the desk mat. But it was the inside title page that made the oxygen vanish from the room. Written in elegant, sweeping black ink was an inscription that methodically dismantled the last fragile pillars of his denial. "To my brilliant Evelyn, for the mind that captivated me from our very first seminar, and the fierce woman who promised to endure the mundane until we could finally build our empire. The waiting is almost over. Yours always, Julian." Daniel traced the sharp loops of the dried ink with a cold, trembling finger. Endure the mundane. That was his entire existence. He was the mundane. The painful reality washed over him like ice water. He was not just losing his wife to a sudden, unpredictable spark of passion or a fleeting workplace romance. This was a calculated, deeply rooted extraction. Julian had known her since her first seminar, years ago. They had been quietly nurturing this intense, intellectual, and romantic intimacy, hiding perfectly in plain sight. While Daniel exhausted his youth and drained his savings to fund the education that brought them together, they were busy mapping out a future that completely excluded him. He carefully closed the book, aligning it perfectly with the edge of the desk just as he had found it. The volume was light in his hands, yet it carried the crushing, suffocating gravity of a 7-year lie. Looking around the beautiful study he had built with his own calloused hands, Daniel realized he had merely constructed the launching pad for her departure. 2 weeks later, the thick, cream-colored envelope bearing the silver crest of Kingsley and Partners arrived at their apartment. Evelyn had officially secured the senior strategic consultant position, a role that commanded a starting salary nearly triple what Daniel made at his mid-sized architectural firm. To maintain the agonizing facade of a proud, unsuspecting husband, Daniel stopped by a boutique bakery on his way home, purchasing a delicate dark chocolate tart she used to crave during her grueling midterm weeks. When he walked into the apartment, the air was already thick with the scent of her expensive new perfume. Evelyn was standing by the floor-to-ceiling window of their living room, her phone pressed to her ear, a triumphant, radiant smile playing on her lips. She held up a single, freshly manicured finger, signaling Daniel to remain silent. "Yes, the compensation package is perfectly aligned with what we discussed," she said, her tone dripping with a corporate velvet he barely recognized. "I will have my new financial advisor look over the stock options by tomorrow morning. Thank you, Julian. I will see you at the dinner." She ended the call and finally turned to Daniel, the brilliant smile instantly dimming into a tight, polite line. "You got the official offer," Daniel said, his voice carefully neutral as he placed the bakery box on the kitchen island. "Congratulations, Evelyn. I brought this to celebrate." Evelyn glanced at the cardboard box, her expression a fleeting mix of pity and mild annoyance. "Oh, Daniel, that is sweet of you, but I really cannot eat sugar right now. I have a formal celebratory dinner with the senior partners at Harborview Restaurant in an hour. It is strictly for the executive team." The casual exclusion landed like a physical blow against his ribs. There was a time when every minor academic victory was celebrated together over cheap takeout on their worn living room rug. Now, the ultimate triumph, the very milestone he had bankrolled with his own sweat, lost sleep, and delayed dreams, was a closed-door event to which he was expressly not invited. "Right? The executive team," Daniel echoed, his eyes drifting to the Kingsley and Partners offer letter resting open on the marble counter. The signing bonus printed in bold black ink was enough to pay off the personal loans he had taken out for her final year of tuition. "Actually, since we are on the topic of the new job," Evelyn said casually, walking over to the hall mirror to smooth an invisible wrinkle from her tailored blazer. "I'm going to be opening a separate bank account for my payroll. With my new tax bracket and the corporate restructuring, it just makes more sense to keep our finances compartmentalized moving forward. It is purely administrative, of course." Compartmentalized. It was a clinical, bloodless word that perfectly described how she now viewed their entire marriage. She was not just building a wall. She was actively untangling her life from his, methodically preparing to sever the safety net he had provided for 7 years. Daniel stared at the untouched chocolate tart on the counter, the bitter reality settling deep in his bones as the heavy front door clicked shut behind her. The morning light filtering through the vertical blinds of the living room felt cold and sterile, matching the atmosphere that had permeated their apartment for weeks. It was Sunday, a day they historically spent navigating the chaotic aftermath of Evelyn's academic week, but today the space was impeccably clean and painfully quiet. Daniel sat on the edge of the sofa, nursing a cooling cup of black coffee, while Evelyn methodically packed a sleek leather weekender bag by the door. She was scheduled to attend a leadership orientation retreat in upstate New York, a mandatory event for all incoming executives at Kingsley and Partners. The very mention of the firm, and by extension Julian St. James, made Daniel's jaw tighten until his teeth ached. He watched her fold a silk blouse with practiced precision, the silence stretching taut between them until it finally snapped. "I heard you at the graduation party," Daniel said, his voice dropping into the quiet room like a stone into a still pond. He didn't look up from his coffee mug, terrified of the raw vulnerability he knew was bleeding into his tone. Evelyn paused mid-fold, her hands hovering briefly over the open zipper of the bag. The hesitation was microscopic, a fleeting glitch in her otherwise flawless armor. Heard me doing what, Daniel? It was a loud party. I spoke to dozens of people. I heard what you said to Julian, Daniel continued, finally raising his eyes to meet hers. They were dark, assessing, and entirely devoid of the warmth he had cherished for 7 years. You call me temporary, a stepping stone. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. Evelyn slowly straightened up, abandoning the blouse on the armchair. She didn't flinch, nor did her eyes widen in the panic of a guilty spouse caught in a lie. Instead, a condescending, deeply patronizing smile spread across her face, transforming her into a stranger. Daniel, you are overthinking this, she said, her voice dripping with artificial patience, the kind an exasperated teacher might use with a slow student. You clearly took a professional joke completely out of context. We were discussing my transition from academia to the corporate sector. I was explaining that my previous administrative support system, my old research assistant, was only a temporary stepping stone until I reached this level. Why on earth would you internalize that as being about you? The sheer audacity of her lie, delivered with such unwavering conviction, physically stunned him. She was rewriting reality right in front of him, effortlessly turning his profound pain into a ridiculous misunderstanding born of his own insecurity. You were not talking about a research assistant, Daniel said, his voice rising, the carefully maintained dam of his anger finally beginning to crack. You were talking about me. You were standing intimately close to a man who inscribed romantic poetry to you, laughing about how I am just a phase you are outgrowing. Evelyn's patronizing smile instantly vanished, replaced by a cold, hard glare that chilled Daniel to his core. She took a step toward him, her posture rigid and aggressive. This is exactly why I need this retreat, she snapped, zipping her bag shut with a sharp, violent motion. Your paranoia is suffocating. I have just achieved the pinnacle of my career, and instead of supporting me, you are inventing elaborate fantasies to make yourself the victim. I am not going to stand here and justify a misunderstood conversation while I have a flight to catch. She grabbed her weekender bag, the heavy leather strap thudding softly against her hip. Without another word, she walked out the front door, leaving Daniel alone in the echoing silence of the apartment, the bitter taste of her gaslighting thick on his tongue. The silence in the apartment after Evelyn's departure was absolute, a heavy vacuum that sucked the remaining oxygen from Daniel's lungs. He stood in the entryway for a long time, the lingering scent of her perfume a mocking ghost. The confrontation had not yielded a confession. It had merely exposed the terrifying depth of her capacity for deception. She had looked him dead in the eye and effortlessly rewritten their shared reality. It was this chilling composure that finally broke his paralysis. He moved methodically, the frantic energy of a man desperately seeking solid ground. He headed straight for her study, the sanctuary he had built with his own hands, now a crime scene of his marriage. Evelyn had taken her laptop, but in her haste to pack for the leadership retreat with Julian, she had left her old, clunky backup tablet buried under a stack of outdated research papers in the bottom drawer of her desk. He remembered setting it up for her years ago, linking it to an old email account she rarely used anymore. Daniel sat in her ergonomic chair, the leather cool beneath his trembling hands, and powered on the device. It hadn't been updated in months, the screen flickering before slowly loading. He bypassed her academic folders and went straight to the archaic email application. The inbox was cluttered with spam and old university notifications, but a quick search for Julian yielded a hidden, archived folder named simply Drafts/J. He opened the first email, dated 4 years ago, during the most grueling, poverty-stricken phase of her PhD program, when Daniel was working 60-hour weeks to keep them afloat. Julian, the financial strain here is unbearable. D is exhausted, but he just picked up another freelance project. He suspects nothing. It's tedious playing the devoted, supportive wife, but his income is the only thing keeping me in the program. We just need to hold on until I secure the associate position. I can endure this temporary setup for our future." The words blurred as a physical wave of nausea hit Daniel. He gripped the edge of the desk, his knuckles white. This was not a recent affair born of success or sudden temptation. This was a long-term, meticulously executed financial and emotional extraction. He clicked through the thread, watching a horrifying narrative unfold over the years. They discussed her academic progress, their shared ambitions, and, most damningly, the careful management of Daniel's resources. There were emails mocking his simple architectural dreams, reducing his life's work to a mere funding mechanism for their grand, elite future. The final email in the thread, dated just 2 days before her graduation party, was a brief, triumphant message from Julian. "The Kingsley offer is secured. The stepping stone has served its purpose. It is time to begin the extraction phase. I will see you in New York." Daniel closed the tablet, the screen going black, reflecting his own hollow, devastated face. The betrayal was complete, absolute, and utterly devoid of remorse. He hadn't just lost a wife. He had been the victim of a 7-year con. The love, the struggles, the late-night assurances, it was all a brilliantly orchestrated performance. He was nothing but a biological ATM, a temporary fixture carefully maintained until she could afford to discard him. The silence of the apartment was no longer suffocating, it was clarifying. He stood up, leaving the tablet on the desk next to the leather-bound book of French poetry. The time for confrontation was over. It was time for his own extraction. The following Sunday evening, the heavy oak door of their apartment at the Meridian clicked open. Evelyn stepped inside, bringing with her the crisp, cold air of the Boston autumn and the faint, unmistakable scent of expensive hotel soap and Julian's bergamot cologne. She looked radiant, her skin glowing with the kind of relaxed vitality that only comes from a weekend of absolute indulgence. She dropped her sleek weekender bag by the console table with a soft, exhausted sigh, already slipping back into the role of the overworked, triumphant executive. Daniel was waiting for her in the dimly lit living room. He sat motionless in the deep leather armchair, the only illumination coming from a single floor lamp casting long, distorted shadows across the hardwood floor. He hadn't slept in 3 days. The frantic, agonizing energy of discovery had burned itself out, leaving behind a cold, crystalline clarity. He was no longer the supportive, oblivious husband. He was a man observing a stranger who had meticulously dismantled his life. "Daniel," Evelyn called out, her voice startled as her eyes adjusted to the gloom. She reached for the main light switch, but his voice, flat and devoid of any recognizable emotion, stopped her hand in midair. "Leave it off," he said. The quiet authority in his tone was new, jarring enough to make her freeze. She slowly lowered her hand, her posture stiffening defensively. "What is wrong with you? I just spent 3 days locked in endless strategy meetings in New York, and I come home to you sitting in the dark like a ghost." Daniel didn't answer immediately. He picked up the heavy, leather-bound volume of French poetry from the side table and tossed it onto the glass coffee table between them. It landed with a dull, heavy thud that seemed to echo in the cavernous silence of the apartment. Beside it, he placed the printed stack of emails from her hidden drafts/J folder. The harsh, white glare of the streetlights filtering through the window illuminated the damning ink. Evelyn's gaze dropped to the table. For the first time in 7 years, Daniel saw the flawless mask of her composure crack. The blood drained from her face, leaving her pale and visibly shaken. She stared at the printouts, her eyes tracking the familiar, incriminating text of her own betrayal. The silence that stretched between them was no longer the comfortable quiet of a shared life. It was the suffocating, heavy atmosphere of a collapsed mine shaft. "You went through my private things," she whispered, her voice trembling, not with guilt, but with the shock of being exposed. It was the desperate, pathetic defense of a cornered predator. "You sold 7 years of my life," Daniel replied, his voice deadly calm. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his eyes locked onto hers with a terrifying intensity. You didn't just have an affair, Evelyn. You executed a business plan. You used my career, my savings, and my love as a temporary funding mechanism for your future with Julian. Evelyn slowly sank onto the edge of the sofa, her posture rigid, her hands gripping her knees. The patronizing, dismissive arrogance she had wielded just days ago was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, calculating assessment of the damage. She didn't cry. She didn't offer a tearful, frantic apology or beg for forgiveness. She simply stared at the evidence, her brilliant mind already spinning, looking for a tactical exit from the wreckage she had created. It wasn't supposed to be this way in the beginning, she finally said, her voice dropping to a harsh, pragmatic whisper. She looked up at him, her eyes hard and unapologetic. But you have to understand, Daniel. We are fundamentally different. You are content building small-town clinics and renovating kitchens. You are a good man, but you have no ambition. Julian operates on a different level. He saw my potential. He understood the empire I wanted to build. You were just the stepping stone, Daniel finished for her, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Yes, she admitted softly, the brutal honesty of the single word severing the final, fraying thread of their marriage. It was a transition. I am sorry it hurts, but I am not going to apologize for securing my future. Daniel looked at the woman he had loved, supported, and bled for. She was a masterclass in ruthless, self-serving survival. There was no redemption here, no tragic misunderstanding to unravel. It was a cold, calculated transaction that had finally reached its conclusion. He slowly stood up, the physical toll of the last few days settling heavily into his bones. The confrontation he had dreaded was over, leaving behind only the stark, agonizing reality of a devastatingly unequal sacrifice. The word hung in the air, a final, brutal judgment delivered in the dim light of their living room. Yes, the acknowledgement of his complete exploitation was not accompanied by tears, remorse, or even a shred of the love she had so convincingly feigned for 7 years. It was delivered with the cold, pragmatic detachment of a corporate merger terminating an unprofitable department. Evelyn sat on the edge of the sofa, her posture rigid, her eyes fixed on the coffee table where the evidence of her deception lay scattered like debris from a devastating wreck. Daniel stood tall, the crushing weight of the last few days suddenly lifting, replaced by a profound, hollow clarity. He felt an eerie calmness settle over him, the kind that follows a violent storm when the landscape is irrevocably changed but finally still. There would be no shouting, no shattered glass, no desperate pleas for reconciliation. She had shown him exactly who she was, a brilliant, ruthless architect of her own ambition, entirely devoid of the emotional capacity to understand the devastation she had caused. You built a very impressive empire, Evelyn, Daniel said, his voice quiet, steady, and entirely devoid of the warmth that used to define him. And you paid for it with my life. Evelyn flinched at the flat, dead tone, her eyes finally snapping up to meet his. For a fleeting second, a flicker of genuine apprehension crossed her face. Not guilt, but the sudden realization that she could no longer control the narrative. The supportive, pliable husband she had manipulated for years was gone, replaced by a man who saw her with terrifying clarity. Daniel, be reasonable, she started, her voice slipping back into its calculated, persuasive cadence. We can manage this transition quietly. There is no need for unnecessary drama. I can ensure you are financially compensated for your contributions during my program. We can draft an agreement. I don't want your money, Daniel interrupted, the sheer disgust in his voice silencing her instantly. I don't want anything that comes from you, Julian, or this manufactured life you've created. He turned away from her, walking slowly toward the console table by the front door where she had dropped her weekender bag. Next to it sat a small, velvet-lined tray where they had always kept their keys and mail. He reached out, his hand steady, and slowly slipped the simple gold wedding band from his left ring finger. The metal felt heavy, a physical manifestation of a promise that had only ever been binding on his end. He didn't throw it. He didn't offer a final, theatrical gesture of rage. He walked back into the living room, his footsteps muffled by the expensive Persian rug she had insisted on buying with his first major bonus. He approached the glass coffee table, bypassing the stack of printed emails, and gently picked up the leather-bound volume of French poetry, the symbol of her hidden, intimate life with Julian. Evelyn watched him, her breath hitching slightly, a tense silence filling the space between them. Daniel carefully placed his gold wedding ring directly onto the center of the dark leather cover. The dull gleam of the metal contrasted sharply with the elegant, worn binding. "You can have your empire," Daniel said softly, his eyes meeting hers one last time. The hollow, devastating truth of their transactional marriage echoed in the quiet room. He turned his back on the woman he had sacrificed everything for, the apartment they had built together, and the ghost of a future that was never truly his. He picked up his coat from the back of the armchair and walked toward the heavy oak door. As his hand closed around the cold brass handle, the silence of the apartment felt less like a tomb and more like an open door. He stepped out into the crisp, biting air of the Boston morning, the faint sound of city traffic a welcome roar against the suffocating quiet he had left behind. The stepping stone has finally crumbled.